I had no idea what this potting mix looked like, and since I was only intending to dirt 2/3 of the bottom, I was also unsure how much I would need. Home Depot only had one size bag, so my decision was not that difficult. The decision of whether to sift or not was not easy. I figured I would stop at the dollar store for a few things and purchase an inexpensive colander and give the sifting idea a try. After sifting a few handfuls of mix, using the colander as it came from the store, I realized it needed some modifications because it was taking way too long to complete. Drilling 1/4-inch holes in the bottom of the colander sped things up significantly. The larger holes did allow bigger pieces of debris to slip through, but a second sift using the side slits removed most of the large pieces. It was necessary to hit the colander with a piece of wood to loosen the dirt from clogging the holes. Prior to sifting, it is helpful to spread the mix out and let it dry. If you try sifting while it is moist, it clogs the colander too easily, and the already tedious process gets very frustrating. It took close to 3 hours to sift the bag, yielding 1 1/3 5-gallon buckets of light, powder-like, debris-free soil, which was bagged and stored until ready to be used. Just after completing a few colanders full of mix, I really wondered if it was worth the trouble, but after seeing what was removed from the original bag, I was glad I took the time and effort to do it. To me, it is preferable not to have that mulch in the aquarium, but the decision is yours. After sifting and bagging the soil, the pool filter sand was rinsed and placed in 2 buckets. One of my concerns was anticipating the difficulty involved of capping wet dirt with wet sand and how to prevent the splattering of the mud when applying the wet, heavy sand topping. By splitting the sand into 2 buckets, one bucket was left outside in the sun to dry for a day, returning it to its powdery consistency. This enabled it to be sprinkled over the mud, covering it completely, and then the remaining wet sand could be applied with less concern of displacing the mud below. The aquarium was drained completely, and any residual water was removed with sponges. I wanted the bottom to be as dry as possible prior to placing the soil. A 5-gallon bucket of aquarium water was kept in reserve to be used to wet the soil. I began forming the barrier using the existing sand substrate. Since the existing sand was wet, it held its shape as it was formed around the perimeter. The height of the perimeter was about 3 inches, and the extra height would be folded down onto the new sand cap. The left-hand side was going to contain a large rock pile, so no dirt was planned for that area. The rock pile was assembled on a half-inch layer of sand, and the semicircle of clay would act as a retaining wall for the stones. 2 stones just right of the pile were placed directly on the glass bottom. Soil and sand would be placed around the stones in an attempt to prevent large areas of obstruction which would have occurred had the stones been placed on top of the finished cap. 2 additional stones were put aside to be used in the aquascape after the substrate was completed. The next step was almost surreal. After keeping fish for almost a half a century and being diligent in my efforts to keep my aquariums as clean as possible, I was now going to willingly introduce dirt into this endeavor. Using one of the large measuring cups, a half-inch of soil was placed inside of the bowl formed by the sand perimeter. After leveling, one 32-ounce spray bottle of water was applied to wet the dirt. After drenching, the soil was patted down. As the soil was compressed, it changed from black when wet to brown when dry. It was obvious as the soil was pushed on, the water was being drawn downward and the top became dry. Another full bottle of water was applied. The soil was tamped down and allowed to soak for about a half an hour. Another half-inch layer of dry soil was placed on top of the previously saturated soil, and the soaking process was repeated. When finished with the dirt layer, a wooden dowel with a 1-inch indicator mark was used to check the consistency of the thickness. Final result was slightly more than 1 inch of wet, compressed soil throughout the area. Looking back at this stage of the process, it is inconceivable to me how attempting to introduce pre-soaked or wet dirt into the aquarium with some degree of control over the integrity of the substrate's layered construction is even possible. Having half the amount of sand intended to create the cap pre-rinsed and dry, topping the soaked soil was not difficult. Again, using one of the large plastic measuring cups, the dry sand was dispersed over the mud with little disruption. Once the soil was covered with a thin layer of dry sand, the remaining wet sand could be dispensed with little threat to disturbing the mud below. Slowly adding and leveling the wet sand and checking the thickness with a dowel indicating a 2-inch mark quickly and neatly completed a fairly consistent grade cap. When satisfied with the result, the perimeter sand was feathered inward to finish it off. The aquarium was slowly filled over the rock pile, and the first of the plants were floated and inserted into their carefully designated areas. A few additional hardscape elements, as well as more plants, are going to be included over the coming few days. It is understood that a new dirted substrate needs to be prodded to expel the nitrogen gas released from the soil. Using a dowel formed into a pencil-like point, I inserted it into the substrate all the way to the bottom glass, then slowly twisting and lifting the dowel to remove. This created the least amount of soil seepage caused by the escaping bubbles as they made their way through the sand cap and to the water surface. After a few rounds of burporama, it became evident that pockets were forming within the sand cap, and all that was necessary was to pierce through the sand layer, it was not necessary to breach the soil layer. Marking the dowel at 1 1/4 inches served as a guide, allowing for sufficient agitation with minimal disturbance to the soil layer. After frequent repetitive probing, the bubble count decreases and the sand cap loosens, allowing the less frequent streams of bubbles to expel on their own.